Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all. I am John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside. And for today, we're fortunate that Sherry Hall has joined us for Celebrate Ohio Week and to share her knowledge of Warren Harding. Sherry has been site manager of the Harding Presidential Sites in Marion, Ohio since 2009. Prior to that, she managed the education programs for the site for 9 years. An historian who specializes in the lives and times of Warren and Florence Harding, Hall is the author of a 2014 book, Warren G. Harding and the Marion Daily Star, How Newspapering Shaped a President. And this morning's session is the Warren G. Harding Presidential Sites, 3 Ways to Explore History. This presentation provides an introduction to the newly restored Harding Home, Harding Memorial Presidential Gravesite, and the new Harding Presidential Library and Museum. As a reminder, the field trip to the Hayes Museum site on Friday morning is filled. So unfortunately, if you had a wish to go, maybe we'll do it again next year into the future. And then also, as you come in and out of Orchestra Hall, there is a table set up with different flyers that are from the different presidential sites that have been here. So it's always something good to kind of check out. If you would please mute your cell phone ringers and help me in welcoming Sherry Hall.
I'm testing my microphone. Can everybody hear me all right? One of the flyers that we have added, this came up the other night, I think, because I've been at all the sessions this week as well. And this is the Harding Symposium that we have every July in conjunction with the Ohio History Connection and Ohio State Marion. And this is very fitting for what we've been talking about this week. This year's theme is Taft, Wilson, and Harding, First Ladies of Consequence. So we're talking about those first ladies who kind of buffeted World War I. Of course, Mrs. Taft beforehand, and then Edith Wilson and Florence Harding dealing with the consequences as well. So there's information about registration and the dates and everything. So we'd love to see you there. I want to take the opportunity to introduce some special guests here in our audience, and that's several members of the Harding family, who by happen chance were taking a vacation this week, and it hit this week. So I want to introduce Dr. Warren Harding III and his wife Barb, and their 3 sons, Warren G. Harding IV, commonly called Chip, Andy Harding, and Jamie Harding. They are descendants of Warren Harding's brother, who Warren called Deacon because he thought he was very serious, which he was. So they are wonderful supporters of our sites. I'm thrilled that they're here this week as well. So as of right now, Warren G. Harding is the last of our Ohio presidents. Maybe that'll change someday. We don't know. And he's the last one to have run a front porch campaign. We talked a little bit about those this week, and there were 4 front porch campaigns, all done by Ohio-born presidents. Garfield having the first one. Benjamin Harrison, we're going to count him because he's one of the Ohio-born presidents, even though he has his front porch campaign at his home in Indianapolis. And then William McKinley, 20 years before the Harding one. So we are going to delve a little bit into Harding's front porch campaign today as well. And I really want to give you a little feel for the Harding presidential sites. We're only an hour and a half from here. So you could scoot down there. If you can't get to Hayes tomorrow, go down to our site. That'll be fine. These are the 3 major components of our Harding presidential sites in Marion. Really unusual that you can visit 3 different sites pertaining to one president in one town, okay? Upper right-hand corner, the greenhouse is the Harding home. That's where Warren and Florence Harding lived for 30 years, from 1891, when it was newly built, to 1921 when they hopped on the train, went to Washington for the inauguration. Neither ever stepped foot in the house again. Okay, President Harding, as we know, died in office. We'll talk about this in a minute. Mrs. Harding, even though she outlived him, never came back to live in that house. But instrumental to what we have today at the site. She willed the house and most of what we call the objects or the collections, three-dimensional things, the furniture, the clothes, everything. The bulk of it was willed to a private group called the Harding Memorial Association, which operated the Harding home for about 50 years. Because of her, things did not get scattered like has happened at some of our other presidential sites across the country. Everything kind of froze in time and stayed intact. So we owe everything for what we are today at the sites to Florence Harding. On the left is the beautiful Harding Memorial Presidential Gravesite. It is the largest memorial to a president outside of Washington. That is the final resting place of Warren and Florence Harding. Bottom right-hand corner, that is our brand new library and museum. Until Obama's is finished, we're the newest one in the country. So in there we have a museum, we have an event space. We still need to build a research wing, which will come in the next few years. The presidential papers for Harding are currently at the Ohio History Center in Columbus. We are a site of the Ohio History Connection, so we are state-owned. And when that wing is built, the Harding presidential papers will come home to Marion. But they are accessible in Columbus, as I said. So just a little look at what we have to offer there. Warren Harding's story really occurred in some pretty small towns along Route 309, pretty much in Ohio, if you're familiar with down around Morrow and Marion County. He's born in Blooming Grove. That house at the top is his birth house. So you can see, you know, the family is not a rich family by any stretch. Blooming Grove was founded by the Harding family as they immigrated from Pennsylvania. They started this little village. So Warren grows up surrounded by all kinds of relatives, aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents. And his parents were George Tryon Harding, and he was a teacher at first, then he became a homeopath doctor. Small towns across the country would have had no medical care if it wouldn't have been for homeopaths. The MDs, those doctors, were usually around the large universities. They're not going to Blooming Grove, okay? There aren't that many of them, but the homeopaths are going to provide medical care to many, many small towns across the country. So very important. Phoebe, Warren's mother, absolutely the spiritual background of the Harding family. She is religious. She is that person you can rely on if you are a child in this family. She is guiding the family. And she eventually becomes a midwife, then a doctor. Very unusual for women at that time in history. Warren is the oldest of 8 children, and a couple born in Blooming Grove. The family relocates to Caledonia. So if you're in my neck of the woods, Caledonia is a Marion County village, and not about 25 minutes present day from Blooming Grove. Caledonia is going to give Doc Harding, Warren's father, an opportunity to grow his medical practice. He also likes to dabble in all kinds of ventures. He likes to buy pieces of real estate and sell them, and he owns part of a weekly newspaper in Caledonia called the Argus. Warren's going to get his first taste of setting type in the Argus office and cleaning up. He was called a printer's devil, and that was a name that meant you're setting type, you're sweeping out the floor, you're doing those odds and ends jobs around the newspaper office. So that he's going to get a little experience as a kid there. He has a very happy childhood. They are a very close-knit family. I can say from knowing the Hardings as long as I have, they are still a very close-knit family. And I think a lot of that has trickled down through the generations. They don't have a lot of money, but they're a happy family, okay? In Caledonia in 1878, Warren was 13 years old. Tragedy strikes the family. He had a younger brother and sister, Priscilla and Charlie. They both had been ill. We're not quite sure what the illness was. Perhaps cholera, perhaps typhoid. There were so many illnesses that went around at that time. They died on the same day. Doc Harding was in Cleveland. He was doing some more medical training, so he was in Cleveland. I doubt he would have left town if he had known these kids were in such dire straits. So it happened quickly. So here's 13-year-old Warren and his mother basically trying to keep the other kids calm, trying to manage this horrible tragedy. And to my way of thinking, that really reinforces the bond between Warren and his mother. And I think I can say with confidence that Phoebe Harding was the biggest influence in young Warren's life. But I think this had a lot to do with it. Now, Warren is a typical rural kid. He has a rural education. What that means is you're pretty much going to go through 8th grade. Okay? He's not going to Yale. He's not going to Princeton. That's not going to be happening. It doesn't pop into his head that that would happen. But he goes to a college called Ohio Central College in another little village called Iberia. And it is between Blooming Grove and Caledonia. So you just follow the road along there. You'll hit all these high spots. Iberia is a funny little place, if I may say so. It was the mecca of education for rural kids back in the 1800s. Ohio Central College was run by an abolitionist who at one point ran out some slave chasers, you know, when they used to hunt them down, ran them out of town. Some say he was tarred and feathered on the way out. I don't know about that. But so Warren is exposed to different ways of thinking. It's a good education. We would equate it more to a high school education now, but it wouldn't match today's high school curriculums. He's learning about the classics. He's learning about philosophy. So it's a college education, but it's not going to get the same treatment that a college would today. Most of the students there are trained to be teachers. And that's what he did at first. He taught at a one-room schoolhouse in Marion. His family had relocated to Marion, so they kept coming a little bit farther west. Marion offers more opportunity, again, for his father to really establish his medical practice. It is a town of 3,500, so you know they're right where all the action is. And when Warren's done with school at the age of 17, he is going to ride the family's mule from Caledonia to the farm they were renting to Marion. So he comes into Marion after an all-day trip on a white mule. Not really, you know, a grand way to come in, but he didn't think much about it. At least he had some transportation. So the family is established in Marion. He is going to teach school at a one-room schoolhouse. Doesn't stand anymore. He hates it. And some of you who have been teachers in the past, I think will like what he said. He said teachers should be paid a lot more for all that they have to put up with. He had some students that were older than he was. And there were it's a pair of brothers. Truly, their names were Jesse and James. And they were quite the behavioral problems and everything. He wrestled with putting up with them all year. He wrote to his Aunt Ada that he only had one more term to go, and he could not wait to get done with that. So 1 year of teaching is all he's going to do. He doesn't know what he wants to do, okay, like a lot of young people. He thinks about studying the law, and that's when you you studied with an attorney. You know, you didn't go to really law school. You had your books. You studied with the attorney. Tried that. No, that's not really doing it. Sells insurance just to get a little pocket change coming in, but that's not going to be his lifelong career either. He decides that, well, he doesn't decide. It kind of happens this way. He hears about a sheriff's sale in Marion. And up for bid is this horrible little newspaper called the Marion Daily Star. It's been passed around from hand to hand. It has never made a profit, and it's called the Daily Star, but it has never been produced daily. Never. It's been produced whenever the owner could get it off the press. So it might be a week, it might be every 2.5 weeks, you know. It's a terrible thing to try to buy. He's 19. He says, I'm going to see if I can get this. So the price is $300, which would be about $10,000 in today's money. So, you know, that's some sizable money. He talks 2 friends of his into going in on thirds with it. He borrows his 100 from his father, and they get it. Not like there's any competition, right? So he's in the newspaper business. It's a very rough start. Everything's in hock at the newspaper, okay? The press is, he owes on everything. And the business community in Marion mostly are of that Civil War generation. They're shaking their heads saying, what is this kid doing? They're chuckling about him because they think this is going nowhere fast. But he doesn't care. He buys out his partners. One continues to work for him, but he says that he would really like a paycheck, so that's why he didn't want to be an owner anymore. Phoebe, Warren's mother, feeds the crew. They can stay at her house, but they sleep a lot of times in the Marion Star office, especially during times of the Marion County Fair. And there's one incident where Jack Warwick, one of the employees, talks about he and Warren, especially Warren, breathing in a little bit too much of the oil-based ink at the newspaper. And he's getting a little hallucinating here a little bit. So they learned that they had to really air out the place a lot. But they learned as they went. And it's not going to make money for quite a number of years. That's Warren at his desk. That's 1910, so quite a few years later. But you can see he has no computer on his desk. He has a telephone, which was a big bone of contention. He and Jack Warwick argued about the necessity of installing a phone. Jack was against it. He thought it was totally unnecessary. Warren thought it would help business, and Warren insisted on it. And that's what solidified Jack. He says, okay, for sure, I'm selling you my part. I don't want any part of this. This is a dumb decision. The phone number for the Marion Star was 51. But by 1920, it was 2251. So it shows you, more people are getting telephones. Florence Harding's going to join our story now. And we've heard some about her this week. I'll just recap a little bit. She is the daughter of Marion's richest man, Amos Kling. Florence is quite a good horsewoman. She would win blue ribbons at the county fair. She was headstrong. She was opinionated, smart. And she followed her dad around as he went to collect rents from the farmland that he owned. He had a lot of business interests. He was a very smart businessman. He made his money by buying farms and then renting them out. He imported French horses, so he routinely went to Europe. He started 3 banks. So he's got a lot of stuff going on. He is not the easiest guy to get along with, and he and Florence kind of butted heads all during her childhood. Her mother, Louisa, is a genteel woman. She's from Connecticut. she's there as a place for Florence and her two younger brothers to kind of land in a soft spot. She's no match for Amos. He calls the shots in the family. And Florence went through the local school system and then went to Miss Norse's academy, which is where Nellie Taft went. And it became part of the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music. She was trained to be a classical pianist, very good at her craft. So music, art, going to be a very big, important part of her life. Cincinnati really was the mecca for culture for the Midwest in those days. That's where you jumped on the train and went if you wanted to see a play or hear a musician. Columbus was, not much is happening there yet. Okay, so we're going to bypass Columbus. You're going to go to Cincinnati. So there's a lot of, in the Marion Stars, before these two even know each other, there are a lot of tidbits when they say, oh, Florence and her mother are going to Cincinnati to see a famous violinist. That's when Warren and his crew are going to be at the train station talking to people. Where are you going today? I'm visiting Aunt Bessie in Mansfield. Those are those personals that used to be in all the newspapers, and people loved to see their name in the paper. That's what sold newspapers. So all these odds and ends, extremely valuable to us historians, I'll tell you. You start learning the fabric of a community and what's going on. All those little things are really important. Florence was married once before. She married Henry DeWolf, sometimes called Petey. He literally was the boy next door. Like, their two houses were separated by a side street. Henry's father was Simon DeWolf. He's got a grain elevator. He's respected as in the community. Henry is really a fun guy for this group of young people Florence is running around with. He's the life of the party. She's going to find out he's not marriage material. Whether he's not mature enough or just not cut out for it, he's not a great choice. She and Henry elope in January of 1880. I know much has been made about, oh, there's no marriage certificate in Marion. There's not. But that's not unusual. Even when I do genealogy for my family, there's some documents I can't find. But I can tell you that people would take things for souvenirs because Warren was a founding member of the Elks in Marion. The pages with his signature have been ripped out of their big book. I've seen it. He was a Mason, not till 1920. Those pages are gone. So, you know, people would take things, whether it was a court employee or whatever. One historian I know says that they must have had not the conventional marriage, but you know, they just basically are living together. That's not going to happen. It's illogical for these two families, for these two kids. They're not brought up that way. And they were awarded a divorce in 1886. And a judge would not have done that if they hadn't been married in the first place. I did find a newspaper, I think it was in Chillicothe, that mentioned the marriage. They got married in Columbus on January 6th in 1880. So they did get married, okay? Marshall, their son, is born the end of September. Now, if you've done the counting and the calendars like I have, I don't expect that you've done this. A big thing is always she's pregnant and they have to get married. I'm not convinced because it ends up being almost exactly counted to the day they get married. If she is pregnant, she doesn't know it. There's no way she could know it. Okay, but that is, you know, why is she getting married? Is it to escape her father's iron hand? I think there could be some truth to that. But we don't know. She never said. She didn't want to talk about this marriage. It was very difficult for her. The marriage ended pretty quickly, even though they're not divorced for 6 years. They moved to, again, another Marion County village, Prospect. I should have brought a map so you could see all these little places. Simon sets Henry up to run a grain elevator there. He doesn't do a very good job. Then he says he's going to start an ice skating rink in Galleon, which is near Blooming Grove. That never happens. Florence's father-in-law is buying their groceries. And they finally move back in with Simon in Marion, right next door to the Klings, where her father is not speaking to them because he's really ticked off about the whole thing. So talk about awkward. You know, you're walking right in front of that house and nobody's going to speak to you. Louisa will talk to Florence, but not when Amos is around. So the dynamics are very strange, very dysfunctional. The two pretty much go their own way after about a year, and then they get divorced in '86 due to negligence on Henry's part. So that gives you the story there. Warren and Florence meet around 1888 or 9, okay? Can't pinpoint exactly when. They both said they met at a dance. I know there's the story that she was giving piano lessons to a sister of Warren's, but I don't think that's true. And I'm going to go by what they both said. And they both independently said they met at a dance. They start courting and end up getting married in 1891. Florence is going to help out at the newspaper starting a few years later. Warren is going to go up to Battle Creek in Michigan, where everybody went up. It was in the newspaper if you went to Battle Creek. It was a place if you were stressed out from your job and you needed just to reset your system, that's what you did. Okay, at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, you were put through all kinds of exercise. You were put on a pretty bland diet. The intent was to reset everything, if you get my drift. So it wasn't anything having to do with a mental illness or anything like that. We know now from the medical records we have that he was experiencing high blood pressure in his 20s. All right? So I think that had something to do with the symptoms he was experiencing, which he was tired. He felt stressed out. Of course, if he's got high blood pressure, that's going to be part of this as well. And he's going to have bouts of this. I don't think it had anything to do with Florence. I think it was his internal system. So she helps out during the 1890s if there's someone in the business department on vacation. She's not going to run the newspaper. Okay? Warren does the editorial product. She's going to kind of recreate the way they deliver the newspaper. Home delivery is already in progress when they get married. It's not efficient. You basically had a middleman, a company who hired the boys, and then you paid the company. So she got rid of the middleman and made the newsboys employees of the Star so she could have more control over them. And that was a great idea. She did pay them $1 silver. Saturday night was payday. And $1 silver is what they earned. Unless they had customer complaints, they still got their dollar, but it was all in pennies. She was known to spank them once in a while. A lot of these boys were not from the better homes, and they said later they needed that. One boy, his bicycle was stolen. The next day, a bicycle appeared. So, but often we have the impression that Florence is this really haughty, cold woman. She's not. You have to peel away the layers to see what she's like. And I think a lot of it's due to that experience with that first marriage. She doesn't trust easily. With Warren, what you see is what you get, okay? Florence, you know her little by little. She often says, I get to know people by looking in their eyes, see if they're telling me the truth. She's not going to reveal herself easily until she knows you pretty well. So newspapering often was the springboard to politics at this time. This is the only way you're getting your news. So the newspapers were powerful. And the Marion Star was doing pretty well in the 1890s. It started making a profit for a change of pace. And this afforded Warren to do the second thing in his life he wanted to do, which was public service. And he and Florence had both decided that once the Star was on pretty firm financial ground, that he could do that. He's elected to the Ohio Senate, and this is the first election in which it's going to be, it isn't going to be the legislatures electing you. Before that, they would, in the congressional districts, they'd pass it around. Oh, Wyandotte County, it's your turn to have the representative this year. People had no input. This is the first time we're going to have popular vote electing the Ohio senators. So he is elected to 2 terms there. He's going to go to Columbus frequently, back and forth. He's always going to own the newspaper, even while he's president. But he's going to get a managing editor by that time to do the daily operation. He's then elected lieutenant governor of Ohio. He serves 1 term. And then he runs for governor in 1910, but he loses that election. Coincidentally, his mother, Phoebe, dies right at the start of that campaign, and he kind of loses his interest in the governor's race. That really takes it out of him when she dies. He runs for the Senate in 1914 and wins that, and then, of course, we have the presidency. So a lot of times you will hear historians, when they talk about that 1920 election, say he came out of nowhere. Nobody knew this guy. Where did he come from? This isn't true. Look at this. Look where he's been. He's very well known. He is invited to speak at lots of Republican clubs. He's a good speaker. He's proud of that. And I've seen in the presidential papers all of the invitations. So he is very well known. He's known as a conciliator, which might be foreign to us today, but he works with Democrats. He works to try to come up with compromise. That is a valued attribute in those days. So, known for all that. So, he doesn't just come out of nowhere. Now, in between here, in 1912, he's going to put Taft's name into the convention. So he's asked by Taft to do that. That's quite an honor. And in 1916, he is elected chairman of the Republican National Convention. And during his speech in 1916, he says this: "In the great fulfillment, we must have a citizenship less concerned about what the government can do for it and more anxious about what it can do for the nation." 1916. Okay? I don't know what Ted Sorensen, President Kennedy's speechwriter, I don't know where he got those words many decades later. I can tell you that they started with Cicero. Okay? Let's think back. Warren Harding in that Ohio Central College is learning about Socrates and Cicero. Has it come back to him for this? I can't tell you. But interesting that that same sentiment comes up in the decades to follow. So let's approach 1920 and see how he got even on the ticket here. Going up to 1920, we've got some things going on. We've been through World War I. President Wilson has had 2 strokes. Some might say Edith Wilson is running the country, right? And there is no plan to transition from wartime to peacetime. So Warren, as senator, is getting letters from like Mr. Timken and Canton, Steele. They've all been making war materials during the war years. What's the game plan, he writes to Senator Harding. What are we doing? And Warren writes back, I don't know what the plan is. The Wilson administration doesn't have anything in place. Now here's where we have a difference in philosophy. President Wilson is of the mind that the president has to sign off on everything. The president is in charge. His cabinet should be a little bit lesser men, but they aren't to do anything on their own. All right, well, now you got a president who's incapacitated. So everything's just sitting. We will see that Warren doesn't have the same philosophy when he forms his cabinet. He's going to call it a best minds cabinet, where he's going to pick the very best people he can for each plot. And he says, I don't know everything that could possibly be going on in the country. I need people who know those things. So very different philosophies of what the presidency should be like. Warren is not supposed to be the nominee in 1920. It's thought leading up to 1919 that Teddy Roosevelt's going to be back because he says he wants to run again. And even though the Republicans are like, oh, geez, not again, whatever Teddy wants, he's going to get, right? Well, then he dies in early 1919. Now, this changes the whole landscape. Now, what's going to happen? Well, going into the convention, the 2 front runners were Frank Loudon, governor of Illinois, and General Leonard Wood. General Leonard Wood had been a Rough Rider with Teddy. Okay, those are the 2 expected to battle it out. Warren is on what they call the second-tier candidates. So you have Warren, you have Calvin Coolidge, you have Herbert Hoover, you have Hiram Johnson from California. And going into the convention, it looks like Loudon and Wood are going to fight it out. But they end up deadlocking. Neither has enough to secure the nomination, enough votes. Neither will give in. And then there are rumors that turn out to be not really rumors, that both Leonard Wood and Loudon's camps are buying some votes. All right, so now everybody's like, well, we can't have a candidate who's been doing this. Those are both cast aside now. Now, who else do we have? And this is when conventions, everything is argued about and hammered out at the convention. It's not the orchestrated thing we're used to today where the balloons come down at a certain time. Okay, and we already know who the nominee is. It's not like that. This is knockout, drag out. So they start looking around, and Warren's name is coming up more and more frequently. And there, on the 10th round of balloting, he secures enough delegates because nobody has anything bad to say about him. Oh, he's a conciliator. Yeah, I worked with him. Yeah, he does well. Nobody had anything bad to say about him. Then they do the whole thing all over again for the vice president. So you're not picking your own ticket. Calvin Coolidge becomes the vice presidential nominee. He's been governor of Massachusetts. He solved the big police riot, I don't mean riot, thank you, and the police strike, and so he's got some good credentials. They're put together on the ticket. They barely know each other, but they get along okay. They're going to be more acquaintances than close buddies. So we've got our ticket on the Republican side, and that's in June of 1920, all right? There has been no campaigning yet. It's improper to do that. They are not going to launch a campaign until what's called Notification Day, which is a leftover tradition from the early days of our country where someone had to get on a horse and ride to you and say, hey, you've been elected, you've been nominated president. Then you can start campaigning. They still have it back then, but it's not till July 22nd. But it's unseemly to start campaigning until after that day. So in San Francisco, the Democrats meet. They have to have 44 rounds of voting before settling on a nominee. They choose Ohio Governor James Cox. Now, if you've not heard of James Cox, you really have, because Cox Communications, that's him. They chose an up-and-comer, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the golden child for the Democrats, to be on the ticket as well. Now, Cox and Harding, both Ohioans, both newspapermen. Remember I told you how consequential the newspaper business was. Cox owns the Dayton Daily News and the Springfield News. Okay? So this is the first time two Ohioans are going to be facing off against each other. If you don't like Ohioans, tough. And this is my little trivia, the Ohio flag there. It is called a burgee. It's the only one shaped like that in the country. So you can stump everyone at dinner tonight. So our stage is set. We're going to have two very different campaigns. Cox is going to run what they called barnstorming, which is basically what we do today, where the candidate goes from town to town. Instead of by airplane like today, he's going to go by train, give a speech, go on to the next town. Warren's going to have a front porch campaign. Okay, now why? Why is he going to do that? This is a throwback campaign, all right? He's going to model it a lot on McKinley's. He's going to go up to, he's not, but his people are going to go up to Canton, get some tips on how best to run it. We have just come out of a war, all right? People are feeling unsettled. People don't know what direction the country is going. They're asking, was it worth it? It kind of reminds me of how it was coming out of Vietnam a little bit. You know, what are we doing? Where are we going? Unemployment rate was 20%. During the Great Depression, it's 25%. It's 4% today. And the reason for that is during the war, jobs were plentiful. We're making, we're making war materials, all right? Armistice Day, everybody's celebrating. You are likely, if you worked in a factory, to get a pink slip that day. We're shutting down your line. We don't need that anymore. Farmers are having a really tough time. During the war, they're asked to produce for the boys in Europe. Armistice Day happens. Okay, we don't need that extra grain anymore. Oh, but my silos are filled. I don't know what to tell you. But I took out loans to buy this farm equipment you told me to do. I don't know what to tell you. I bought extra land. So farmers are losing their farms. This is a real pivotal place in history at this point, is how is this going to be handled? How are we going to get back on our feet? Who's going to untangle this mess? Our reference point for the government coming out of World War I was the Civil War. We had no experience doing this. And so that wasn't going to help. So there's a lot on whoever is going to be president on their plate. So Warren has a front porch campaign. He's going to do it in his hometown of Marion. He's been living in Washington in his Senate home, but they have never sold the house in Marion. This is going to be a time when people are going to come to him. He's going to give each group, they were called delegations, a speech on whatever their main interest was. It was fun. for those of us in Marion, boy, this was really exciting to have all these people coming. The campaign starts July 31st. It's going to last 3 months. All right. This is a picture in downtown Marion. People have just gotten off the train, and they are headed to the Hardings' home. There was always a marching band or two leading the way. So it was fun, too. There were committees and more committees formed to take care of the campaign, and I argue it would not have been successful without the people of Marion doing that. Marion was a town of 28,000 at the time. There were going to be days where the population doubled. Well, these people had to eat, they had to find restrooms, they had to be shown directions around town. So in the newspaper, there were all these updates on the number of Frankfurters being ordered. Rest assured, there's going to be enough Frankfurters for everyone. Don't panic. It's going to be all right. The restaurants had what we would call concession stands along the street, but their words were so much more fun. They called them emergency restaurants. I wanted to bring that phrase back because that tells me, I need a Frankfurter, I need it now. It's an emergency. So a lot of work went into this campaign. Buildings all decorated. You can see people leaning out of those upstairs apartments, seeing what's going on down below. When they got close to the Hardings' house on Mount Vernon Avenue, Warren and Florence would wave to them and greet them as they came down the street. This is what they'd see. More than 600,000 people came to Marion, Ohio, of all places, during the 3 months of the Harding campaign. Now, when you come, which I know you will, when you come to the sites, you will see that the front yard of the Harding home is very small. So you can't even tell where it is. They're in his yard, the streets, the neighbor's yard, a few even in the trees to get a good vantage point. And he's going to give a speech from his front porch. He could use amplification equipment. It had been invented, but it was big, clunky pieces of equipment. He just wanted to do it the old-fashioned way, what he was used to. He just talked kind of loud. But the people in the back don't really expect to hear anyway. They're just there for the experience. There will be no hecklers in this crowd. And the same for the Cox speeches. The people attending have already made up their mind. They are supporters. So the word that they're trying to get out is, look at all the support we've already got. You should get on board too. And of course, this is the election in which women are going to have the right to vote. Neither campaign had any experience dealing with women voters. They had to figure out what should we say to the women? What do they want? The women suffragists were very adamant about what they wanted. They talked to both candidates many times, saying that they wanted more job opportunities for women. They wanted appointments in the federal government who were women. They wanted the same pay as men for the same job. How long has it happened yet? I don't know. That's what they wanted. I don't think either campaign handled the women voters extremely well. Warren Harding has been for suffrage. He assumes it's going to happen. So it's like, yeah, it's no big deal. It's going to happen. Cox is taking Wilson's stand against suffrage, and then he'll reluctantly accept it. One thing to understand about suffrage, it is not a gender issue. There are men and women on both sides of the issue. Edith Wilson, for example, against suffrage. So it is not what you think. It is not a gender issue at all. And yes, I was giddy. I was playing around with my PowerPoint. So this is his main campaign slogan, a return to normalcy. He did not make up the word normalcy. It was already in the dictionary, along with normality. So he didn't make that up. Now, historians have misinterpreted what he means by this. They say, well, he just wants everything to go back like it was before the war. He's not naive. He knows he can't go back in time. What he means, and he explains this, what he means is let's go back to a normal way of living where we're not looking over our shoulder to see when the next catastrophe is going to happen. Let's get back to just living our lives. That's what he means by normalcy. He is not saying, oh, let's go back to 1914. No, that's not what he's saying. He says, let's just live normally. And people really like that sentiment. Now, he also has kind of a sub-slogan that you might have heard of called America First. All right? Everybody in the world has used that slogan. I'm here to tell you that. Wilson used it first, then Harding. Then during World War II, there was a group who was against going to war in World War II. They used it. Pat Buchanan used it. It's meant something different every single time. So just because you see that doesn't mean, oh, he's doing the same thing as this person 100 years later. No, they had different meanings. He is not an isolationist. All right? Wilson, and therefore Cox, is campaigning on the League of Nations. But the American people have moved past the League of Nations. They're not interested anymore. And by September, Cox says in his autobiography, I knew we were going to lose. American people don't want to hear anything more about the League. People are against the League because they don't want to be entangled in Europe. And Europe isn't a mess after World War I. It looks like fighting could break out next week because they're still squabbling. There is immense damage, and it's totally unstable. A lot of Republicans are isolationists at this time. Warren Harding is not. He understands that we have a global economy now. But the League of Nations is not the way to go about it. It was very evident that World War I was caused by alliances. You know, one person joins, well, we've got an alliance agreement, now we have to. Everybody knows that. So there's an article in the League of Nations called Article 10. Warren Harding and some Republican senators are against that because of Article 10, which basically says if any country goes to war who's a member of the League, you have to go too. They said, we just had a war that was caused by alliances. Why are we doing this again? The argument was not over the sentiment of the League of Nations for Warren Harding. It was on, let's not get dragged back into it because we signed this thing. If we believe in it and we want to help someone, that's a different matter. That's what his issue is. So he realized, in fact, he wants a stronger merchant marine for trade among nations. He knows it's a global economy. So he did go also off the front porch. He visited 13 other states, little trips, 3-4 days on the train kind of thing. And at the Harding home, I didn't show you a picture, there is a little white cottage behind the Harding home called the Press House. Let's remember what his vocation was. He's a newspaper guy. He has this little kit house. It's not a Sears house, but we don't know what kit it is, but it is one. Built in 2 days' time. And this is workspace for 17 of the best journalists in America who are all coming to Marion to cover not only what he's going to say from the front porch, but the color stories. What are the people saying? And they're covering all kinds of things. These are mostly metropolitan newspapers from the East Coast, except for the Marion Star. It's in there too, but it doesn't have to travel far. So the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Baltimore Sun, Philadelphia News Ledger. The smaller papers can't afford to have somebody embedded with the campaign. They can't afford the room and board for that. Nobody out on the West Coast, there's nothing going on out there. You know, the towns are little. Nobody's even paying attention to the West Coast. But this is how everyone across the country is going to learn what's going on in Marion, Ohio. Newspapers. There's also newsreel footage taken. So this is called the first modern campaign, because you've got newsreel footage that when you go to the movie theater, it's going to show before the featured film of the day. And a lot during those 3 months were film taken in Marion. During the campaign, Al Jolson did organize the Harding Theatrical League. He organized 60 members from Broadway who came, and they cavorted with the crowds. You know, they told jokes, they sang little songs, but just to show they were supporting Harding as well. The Chicago Cubs came through. Harding's a big baseball fan, as is Florence. They both kept, if you know what kept book means at a baseball game, they both kept book. Even Florence did, which I'm very proud of her for doing that. So Harding had said once that the only problem he had with the campaign is he'd be missing going to baseball games. Well, Wrigley, owner of the Cubs, says, well, you know, teams traveled by train back then. Said, what if we swing through? So the Cubs came. They played an exhibition game with the local team, Kerrigan's Tailors. Now, Chicago loaned a catcher and a pitcher. Alexander Grover was the pitcher to Kerrigan's, and which, you know, that's fair. And they won 4-1, thankfully, because how embarrassing would it be for the Cubs to lose to Kerrigan's Tailors? But again, fun stuff, big names, things that were going to show that this campaign had a lot of life to it. Election day was November 2nd, 1920. That was Warren's 55th birthday. So far, he's our only president elected on his birthday. There were 76 cakes sent to the Harding home. That's when they quit counting. He played golf that day at the Scioto Country Club in Columbus, and then returned to Marion. They had the birthday cake and some dinner, and then started waiting for the election results to come in. He won big. 60.3% of the popular vote, 404 electoral votes. So he is set to go to Washington. Now, remember that return to normalcy slogan? That was a real thing. So in April of 21, he goes to Congress and outlines the normalcy program. These are policies to back up that slogan. This is just a snapshot of what was on his domestic agenda. Increase the tariff. Tariffs were not a bad thing back then. They weren't thought to be. Increase the tariff to help farmers, lower people's taxes. Install a national budget system. We had none. Congress went agency by agency and approved or turned down what the requests were. They had no idea what the federal budget looked like across the board. Warren said, I have to have a budget system in managing my little newspaper. Why aren't we doing that at the federal level? So the Bureau of the Budget was installed, and for the first time, we could actually see what our government was doing financially. He wants to create a strong merchant marine. Remember that trade that he foresees. He can't get that through Congress. He's going to reduce railway rates, create new farm credit legislation to help those farmers. And this is something that Congress and the president, everybody agreed on. It was not a bone of contention. Tighten immigration controls. Strangely enough, everybody said there had to be quotas. There were quotas before Harding came into office. They're going to be tightened. And it wasn't any argument from anybody anywhere. That was just the thinking at the time. In foreign affairs, he's going to implement a vehicle for world disarmament. It's not going to be the League, but he says, yeah, I agree, we need something. And then investigate an association of nations to prevent war. We're still legally at war. So when on Jeopardy, when you're watching and they say, who ended World War I, you'll shout out Wilson and you'll be wrong. No, Jeopardy will say, no, that's right. They will. Because sometimes this has happened and I email them and, no. Yeah, I have done that. I hate to say that, Harding family, I have done that. We are still legally at war when Warren Harding comes to office. He ends World War I. So he's got to arrange the peace treaties with the former Central Powers. And we owe a lot of money. We've got to institute an orderly funding of war debts. So that's what's on his plate. That's not even the social issues that are going to be going on. After the war, there are lots of injured soldiers. After every war we always have this. But our medical training improves so more of them survive each war, right? The hospitals, particularly around Washington, are filled with these soldiers who are amputees, who are suffering from shell shock. We call it PTSD today. They have lost arms. They are blinded from the mustard gas in the trenches of France. What do we do with them? They wouldn't have survived earlier, like the Civil War. Civil War, if you were injured, you just hobbled home if you could. Now what do we do? So the Veterans Bureau was authorized to not only help provide medical service to these men, but also job retraining so they could assimilate back into society. And Florence and Warren both were big parts of that. Florence suffered from chronic kidney disease. She nearly dies on several occasions. She knows what it feels like to be in the hospital for months on end. She spends a lot of time just visiting with the soldiers. She calls them my boys. And she hosts garden parties at the White House for those able to be transported, just to get them out of the hospital for a little bit. She arranges for the best flowers in the White House greenhouses to be sent first to the hospital wards. That's a big deal. Flowers are a very personal gift from Florence Harding to anyone. And we also had bodies being shipped back from Europe that were temporarily buried in France. Well, now they're coming back. And one of the most heart-wrenching scenes and speeches of President Harding was in Hoboken, New Jersey, where he and Florence went. There were 5,000 caskets coming back. And it's a very heartfelt speech. But those boys were going home. It was not unusual for Florence to send a box of flowers to a mother of one of those boys in Kentucky or Missouri and say, thinking of you today. And she did that, and nobody knew it. It wasn't in the newspapers. So the veterans very much on their mind. Then we had social issues. After the war, a lot of social issues bubbled again to the surface. American Indians in the upper left-hand corner were not U.S. citizens. They were, as has been mentioned this week, being sent to training schools to basically strip them of their culture. And that's not going to change during the Harding administration. But he wants them to have citizenship. He doesn't accomplish that before he dies, but Coolidge takes the mantle and does. He wants a public welfare department. Okay? Unusual for a Republican at that time. So that picture in the middle of the top is just showing the state of women who need some help in caring for their children, the infant mortality rate is extremely high in the early 20s. So he does not get that through Congress. In the upper right-hand corner, lynchings are alive and well, unfortunately. The KKK has had a resurgence after the war, and it's alive and well in our part of the country as well. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, we're into it okay, too. He supports an anti-lynching bill, the Dyer bill, and works with the NAACP to try to move that forward. He does not get that through the Southern Democrat bloc. In fact, it was brought up many times in the decades since the Hardie administration, an anti-lynching bill. It didn't pass till about 4 years ago. This is one of my favorite pictures, this car down here. Each state improved the roads that they thought were the most important. Okay, and they would pave them. A lot were just dirt or mud, depending upon the weather. So you might be on a highway in Ohio and reach West Virginia, and then the road turns to dirt. Warren said it was evident to him that automobiles were here to stay, and we should have a comprehensive highway system using federal and state matching funds. So we usually think that's Eisenhower, right? He starts it in the 20s. How about aviation? There are a lot of pilots from World War I. They are working mostly as crop dusters. He is foreseeing that we will need some kind of airports by 1930. And he thinks people will be traveling by airplane by then. So that's a brand new industry that often comes up out of wartime as we have new technology, new things coming. And radio is going to debut on the night of his election, KDKA radio out of Pittsburgh. And then it takes off like wildfire, but it needs to be regulated, or else you're going to hear, if you remember turning into a radio station and hearing the bleed through from other stations, everybody's got to be assigned a frequency. So he puts that under Herbert Hoover, who is his Secretary of Commerce. So radio is a big communication industry. So if Warren Harding had interpreted normalcy as going back to the old days, he wouldn't have accepted this vision of these changes in society. And this was a new era. He was going to be that bridge from the old time to this new era of America. And this is just my belief. I think that we need that every once in a while. You need that transitional person. So the last summer of his life, as it turns out, he is going on a trip across the country to the western states, Canada, and Alaska. This is not a campaign trip. It was supposed to have occurred in the summer of 22, but he has to stay in Washington because there are serious threat of strikes in the coal and rail industries, which could really decimate the country. So he can't leave, and he really didn't want to wait till 23 because he doesn't want it seen as a campaign trip. His goal is Alaska, the territory, because he wants to see for himself. This is Editor Harding, in my opinion. Wants to see all sides of a question. He wants to see what is going on in Alaska as far as the indigenous people are complaining that they are getting stripped out of the fishing industry. We're taking it over, big developers. And of course, the oil. Everybody wants the oil. So he wants to see for himself. There are 8 federal agencies with their fingers in Alaska. And he's getting contradictory reports from all of them. So he says, I'm going to go see for myself. On the way, he's going to check in with the American people. He calls it the Voyage of Understanding because and this is very simple, but he thinks if the American people understand what the administration is trying to do to help them, and the administration understands what the people still need, then we can solve more problems. So it's a very simple premise. So it's not going to be unusual for him to stop the train in Kansas and say, wait, I want to get off. I see a farmer over here. I'm going to talk to him about what's going on. He wants that personal feedback from people. He's going to stop in factories and talk to people there. These pictures were both taken in Alaska. He's not going to give speeches too many along the way. He doesn't intend to anyway. He considers it more of an investigative trip. But he keeps getting more and more requests to stop and talk, and he doesn't have the heart to turn people down. He should have. He's already exhibiting some pretty serious health symptoms. Before he leaves Washington, he's complaining of chest pains. He can't sleep lying down. Feels like he has an elephant on his chest. He's got indigestion. And he's already showing those symptoms. They only increase as the trip continues. When the trip returns to the mainland in Seattle, that's when he falters during a speech. Drops his papers. Hoover picks him up. Nobody really notices. But it's clear that something's the matter. They decide to put him on back to the train and cancel all the West Coast appearances. Dr. Sawyer, who is on the trip, he is particularly Mrs. Harding's personal physician. He puts out a statement that maybe the president ate some bad crab meat. That's where that comes from. Even though anyone else who ate the crab meat, they were fine. On the train, Dr. Joel Boone, Harding's naval physician, does an examination, discovers that the president has an enlarged heart. He says, we're going to San Francisco. Stanford University is there. There are cardiologists there. There weren't very many cardiologists anywhere in those days. Cardiology was a very new branch of medicine. So that's why they go there. They go to the Palace Hotel, to the Presidential Suite. Presidents traditionally weren't taken to hospitals. They weren't until very, really more recent times. And he's put to bed. All right? There are medical reports that were put out at least daily, sometimes twice a day. We have all of those medical reports. All right? They have been interpreted by not only Dr. Richard Harding, who is a brother of Warren's, but he submitted them to a panel of cardiologists. He's got serious heart problems. There's just no doubt about it. He's having respiration problems. He is panting at times to get his breath. Okay? So after a few days, there's nothing to do for him. There's nothing. They give him digitalis. I'm looking at Warren. I don't know why I'm looking at you. I'm like, help me out here. Digitalis. And they give him an enema once in a while just to torture him, I guess. But there's nothing to do for him. There's no blood pressure medicines. And he's been suffering with high blood pressure for decades. Even though his brother said, well, you need to watch your diet and you need to do this, he really didn't pay attention to that. They didn't know if symptoms like the chest pains and such caused heart problems or if the heart caused the symptoms. Okay? So it looks after a few days like he's getting better. In fact, the day he died, his sister, who lived in California, comes to visit him, and he says, I think I'm out of the woods. And that night, Florence is reading a magazine article to him called A Calm Review of a Calm Man. And his nurses are there, Sue Dowser, Ruth Powderly. They actually were Florence's nurses. Remember, she's got the kidney disease. She was the one thought to be in the most danger on this trip. They are there. Doc Sawyer is in and out of the room. Everybody else, the other doctors, the press, they've all kind of gone to the dining room to get something to eat because things look better. They're finally like, phew, we can go outside and have a smoke or whatever. Florence is reading this article, and he says, that's good, go on. And he gives a shudder, and he's gone. Okay, so he is brought back to Washington. There is no autopsy done, but we'll talk about that in a second. That was a editorial cartoon showing Laddie Boy at the door, which Laddie Boy did wait at the door for Warren to come back to the White House. It was shocking to people. They had seen all these newsreels of him playing golf and everything. So they were like, what in the world happened? So we talked about some of the accomplishments here before that don't get much press. Just a couple. He placed the issue of race relations on the national table. We talked about the treaties for World War I. The Bureau of the Budget and Veterans Bureau had the first peace conference in which he was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. And the thing he was most excited about, he laid the groundwork for balance between conservation and development of natural resources in Alaska. We could use that today, couldn't we? So what went wrong? He goes from being a very popular president, and then his reputation suffers. We have to acknowledge this, okay, and we do at the sites. He's dead. We lose his voice. Mrs. Harding dies 15 months later. We lose her voice. And now that opens the door to all kinds of these books who are just going to start spewing allegedly inside information. And a thing that's very damaging is the Harding Memorial Association, who is first opening the Harding home to the public in 1926. For the next 40 years, won't let anybody research in the presidential papers. The papers belonged to the president at that time, not like today. Okay, so they were in the basement of the White House, and they were transported to Marion in 7-foot-long wooden crates. They wouldn't let anybody research in them. So if you had a valid author who wanted to get to the bottom of things, they couldn't. And so they just kept drawing on all these rumors and myths and churning them up all the time. And then the Harding presidency was overshadowed. We go forward with history, the Depression, World War II, blah, 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 blah. Okay? So here's some of the rumors and myths we still deal with today. Harding orchestrated the Teapot Dome scandal. No, he did not. That was Albert Fall. It didn't come out till after Harding's death that Albert Fall, and it wasn't about leasing government oil lands. That was legal to do. The General Leasing Act of 1920 and the Wilson administration said that's okay. We still do that today. The problem was he didn't abide by the open bid regulations and gave it seemingly to people, to oilmen that he knew. That was the problem of it. But it's in the news all during the 20s, so it's attached to Warren. And if you believe Harry Truman, the buck stops here. Okay, that's one of his guys. Harding belonged to the Ku Klux Klan. All right, this comes, the Klan itself, when it was trying to increase membership in the 20s, had a guy named Joseph Camp. He was their main speaker. And he would try to get new members, and he would say, your president belongs, so you should join too. So letters were written to the White House saying, is it true? Is it true? And they're like, no, it's not true. And if you go down to the last one, there was a rumor that he had black blood. You cannot have both, I argue. You can't have him in the Klan and have black blood at the same time. You got to pick your rumor. You know, the black blood story had been around for a long time. Warren himself said, I don't know if it's true. I don't. But there was a guy named William Chancellor, who was a professor at the College of Worcester, who during the campaign had heard this rumor and made up a family tree and circulated that. And he was afraid that if Warren won, that the whole social order would be turned upside down. It was basically that. Harding had countless mistresses, fathered many illegitimate children. We confirmed 2 relationships. Carrie Phillips, a 10-year on-again, off-again, an on-again relationship, and Nan Britton. She wrote a book in 27 called The President's Daughter. As it turns out, well, and it's very complicated. I could do a program just on this, but she charged that the president was the father of her daughter, but there were no letters. There was nothing. DNA didn't exist yet, so there was no proof of it. Nan's reputation was well known. She had grown up in Marion. She had, as a teenager, shadowed Harding as he went to the Star office, and her infatuation with him was well known. I look at her book as telling us 2 stories. One, we know now with DNA that President Harding did father her child. The book itself, with the over-the-top description of this relationship, which she describes as kind of the love affair of the century, had been embellished. We know that by her publisher. So I look at them as 2 separate issues. Let's see, Harding played golf instead of working. Our research shows he was a very hardworking president. His doctors wanted him to play more golf for exercise. He played when he could, but he was a very hardworking president. Harding was poisoned by his wife. This came up a couple times this week. That started with a book by a man named Gaston Means in 1930. He writes this book called The Strange Death of President Harding, in which he floats this poisoning theory. And he had dictated this book while he was serving time in the Atlanta penitentiary. Apparently had some time on his hands. Okay? So dictates it to a woman named Mae Dixon Thacker. She's the wife of the chaplain. She believes the story, and she writes it. And then she realizes she'd been duped. He's out of prison by then. And she tries to stop the book from being published, but it's too late. She writes an article for the Saturday Evening Post, basically saying, don't believe this, it's all malarkey. But people, strangely enough, they really like this salacious story. So we've been dealing with the poisoning for decades. And this leads us in, there was no autopsy, right? That's because it's apparent he died of natural causes. Autopsies were not routinely done for anybody. It's not till you get past Gaston Means' book where the poisoning thing, well, why didn't they do an autopsy? Well, now you're armchair quarterbacking, you know? So there was never any evidence. Like I said, we have the medical records. It's clear he's got massive heart problems. And he was unpopular as president. Not true at all. He's very, very popular. So I'm back to the sites here. I will take any questions you have. Sorry I went so long. Thank you.
Sherry, what was the rationale for the Harding Memorial Association keeping his papers closed for so long?
It's hard to figure out frankly, but the head of the Harding Memorial Association was Doc Sawyer's son, Carl. Carl had never even been through the mall, but I think that he was always fearful that the papers would contain some smoking gun about his father and if he didn't care for him as well as he should. In their way of thinking, I think they were trying to protect Harding from any other bad stuff being said. You know, not the right thing to do, but that's the best I can figure out. But it did a lot of harm, a lot of harm.
I'm a little bit confused from what I heard in earlier sessions. I thought I had heard someone say that years after his death, he was exhumed and an autopsy was performed, but it was inconclusive.
I heard that too. We've had no exhumations, no.
I have a question for the Harding family. And the question is, President Harding's middle name, could you give us the pronunciation you guys use? And also, where did the middle name come from?
Well, first, before I answer that simple question, I'd like to say that sitting here in Lakeside with Sherry giving this excellent summary of the Harding legacy, that I've been very pleased that we have Sherry as the site manager of the home and site in Marion, and also that the Harding family has benefited greatly from well over 50 years of Lakeside associations. So it's we're doubly blessed. But to answer the question, Gamaliel is the G, and I'm not sure if President Harding ever used it. I didn't know how to spell it until I was about in the 8th grade, but I have found out since that Gamaliel was a Greek lawyer who taught, and he's mentioned a couple of times in the Bible.
That's right.
Do any of the newsreels exist in your library of, as you mentioned, as one of the news communications of the time?
Yes, we have a lot of the newsreel footage. In our museum, we have, we kind of divvied them up. There's some of the campaign, there's some of the funeral, there's some of the Western trip. And, you know, they're invaluable. When you can see people moving around and you get more of a sense of them as people.
About 20 years ago, I took an 8th grade class to the home site for a visit. So I'm wondering, when was the museum built? Because it certainly wasn't there then.
The museum just opened in 21. So it was supposed to open in 20, but we seemed to have a little pandemic going on at the time. It was supposed to be the 100th year after the campaign. So it was postponed a little bit, but it opened in 21. So, and then the home opened to the public in 1926, just 3 years after the president died. That also followed something Florence wanted. She wanted people coming to the home to learn about her husband and what he tried to do for America. So much of what we do today is Florence's vision. It's what she laid out a long time ago. Anything else? I have 2 bonus pictures for you, just for fun. Can you tell where that is? Yeah, this is in the 1890s. So Warren is here. Let's see if, I don't know, I know this has a, he's over on the right side. These are a lot of his sisters. Florence is there, so we know that, another reason we know it's the 1890s. I'm working on figuring out where this was. So I'm not quite sure. At present, I think it's on the other side of the hotel, but I don't know if the house still stands. But pretty cool that he was here. So if anybody can figure it out, you let me know. And come down and see us at the Harding sites. Yeah. I should have shown that picture first, huh? Yeah. My path to this role is very unconventional. I was a journalist in my other lifetime. I worked in my younger newspaper days at the Marion Star, where we had an office. There was an office with his desk and everything in it. We really felt like we were continuing his work. The Marion Star does exist barely these days, like a lot of community newspapers. It would make Warren very sad. And then I worked at the Canton Repository. I worked at the Alliance Review. I started out in sports writing. So then I came back home when I got married. This is way too much information. And when my kids stayed home with them till they were in school, and then started volunteering at the Harding home, and then how things happen. It went into, I was doing the education program and then became site manager. And I know people ask me a lot, well, this is so different from newspapering. And I said, no, it's exactly the same. I'm still trying to tell a story in an understandable manner. And my newspapering background and my research skills have really come in super handy. But thanks for asking.
Sherry, there was one question, some individuals who have already left, but they were wondering, does anyone know why Dr. Sawyer became a doctor?
Doc Sawyer was regarded as a very good doctor. He had a sanitarium in Marion, and that's when you had a real boon of sanitariums throughout Ohio and the Midwest. They were popular places for people to go and just rejuvenate themselves, relax, and get yourself situated again. He was a very good doctor. Very well regarded in Marion. Mrs. Harding totally trusted him. He was also a very good friend of hers. And we see right before her death in November of 24, she lost Warren the year before, but then Doc dies of a heart attack in September, and that just does it for her. It's like we can see her throwing in the towel. She loses, Doc was presumably her best friend, really was. And when she loses him, we just see the life kind of go out of her.
Well, thank you very much, Sherry.
You're
Thank you.
welcome.